Yeah, this is a very topical subject, so I'm going to talk about what the Bible teaches about extraterrestrial life. Lots of people are asking the question, could there be life out there in the universe other than here on the Earth? But I also want to talk about some of the searches that are going on for extraterrestrial life, because a lot of resources of NASA and ESA, a lot of money is going into searching, and I can give an inside view, having worked for the European Space Agency, about exactly what's going on. So the first part of the talk will be just some insight into the projects searching for life in space, and then the second part is Bible teaching. So it really splits into those two things. As I said before, I have a background working for the European Space Agency. I actually worked a little bit on the Hubble Space Telescope because ESA produced the solar panels for that spacecraft. NASA produced the main telescope, so I worked a little bit on that. My most recent project was the METOP-C, European Satellite for Better Weather Forecasting. That was launched in November 2018, last year, about 1 year ago. So that was the last project I worked on. I was never asked to work on a project searching for extraterrestrial life. Some of my colleagues did at ESA. Had I been asked, I would have declined to work on those projects. Space is good for communications, for exploration, the solar system, but I wouldn't have worked on searching for something that doesn't exist, which I'll explain about later. And as was mentioned before, I've written a book on the stars. He made the stars also. The second half is all to do with extraterrestrial life. So if you're interested in this talk, you can have more details from that book. The first half of the book deals with design in a clockwork universe, design in the solar system, design in the universe. Also deals with the question of distant starlight. I published this book in 2002, I think. And in that book, I proposed a mature starlight theory where God may have just speeded up starlight. That was in 2002. Just a couple of years ago, Danny Faulkner at AIG actually wrote that perhaps God speeded up the starlight in a miraculous way, very similar to what I said in 2002, quite some time ago. So I was quite encouraged when he wrote about that. So where has the interest in extraterrestrial life come from? It's kind of gradually over history. This is a really crude summary. If you go back to Copernicus, he correctly pointed out that the Earth is not the geographical center of the universe. And when he pointed that out, a few people said, "Ooh, does that mean the Earth isn't that important? Could there be extraterrestrial life?" It just created a tiny bit of interest. Of course, what Copernicus said didn't detract at all from the truth that the Earth is very special and the center of God's purposes in the universe. So what Copernicus discovered wasn't a problem for Christians. But it was when Darwin proposed the theory of evolution, then people did suddenly become very interested in the prospect of extraterrestrial life. Because if Darwin was right, then perhaps life could just appear on any old planet in the solar system or the universe. And H.G. Wells, who was the first famous science fiction writer, was very influenced by evolutionists like Darwin. I should say at this point that, of course, there's nothing inherently wrong with fiction. Fiction can be great. There's nothing inherently wrong with science fiction, not inherently wrong. Although, like any fiction, you have to be careful if it's corrupted by dark powers, supernatural powers, or distortions of God's creation. So there's nothing inherently wrong with science fiction, but like everything, you have to be careful with it. So when science fiction came along, people like H.G. Wells, then that increased further a fascination with extraterrestrial life. And then when probes went to planets like Mars, again, that increased the interest. And more so in America, there are many people absolutely fascinated. It's almost become a religion, searching for extraterrestrial life. So that's a kind of a quick overview. So what is the secular motivation? Well, if you can find enough stars and planets in the universe and find enough that maybe are a bit like the Earth, then it improves the chances of evolution being demonstrated. We've heard before, evolutionists have faith in time. They need time, but they also need a vast universe. If the universe is old enough, if it's big enough, then it's easier to have this faith that life could just start by chance. A big motivation of the evolutionist is to try again and again to say that man is not important. It's a really important part of their theology, so much so it's almost not really rational. And we heard that in some of the video clips earlier, trying to say man is not special. They're really trying to attack God's word. And searching for extraterrestrial life, for many evolutionists, it gives them a purpose in life. There's one particular book on extraterrestrial life, and the subtitle is Giving Purpose to Life on Earth. Just it gives very meaning and purpose, just searching for this extraterrestrial life. Just mentioned the panspermia theory, the idea that life was seeded from other planets. That's becoming very popular. And of course, it just moves the problem to another place. It's all very well saying, well, life didn't have to start on Earth, but, well, it had to start somewhere, so where did it start? Those who are a little bit older here might remember in 1996, there was a great world headlines that NASA had found evidence of life on Mars, which turned out to be completely false. The point here being that if there's any possible evidence of life in space, it will create massive headlines, and it might happen this year or in the next few years. You might see enormous headlines of possible evidence. It just creates huge news. Even the President of the United States made a statement after this. Interestingly, the discovery of life on Mars happened like a few weeks before the American Senate was going to rubber stamp a huge grant to NASA. And all academics know that it's quite handy if you exaggerate a few claims, if you're just about to get a big grant. And then once you got the grant, you can then say, well, actually, I think that might not be true, actually. That's how academia works. But it's very, very important. So coming to the first part of the talk, the search for extraterrestrial life, and I'll go through these interesting ways that, well, if you're a taxpayer, this is how your money's being spent, searching for these things that don't exist. So a physics book will say the ingredients for life: liquid water, biogenic materials, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, energy, light, chemical, or heat. So you go to a place like Mars, does it have water? Does it have biogenic materials? Does it have energy? And the body's thought to have those elements: Mars, Europa, the moon of Jupiter, and Titan, the moon of Saturn. So if you follow the news, you'll notice a lot of spacecraft go to those places: Mars, Europa, Titan, not the other moons. It has to be those, because there is this absolute fascination. Will we find life on Europa, on Titan, on Mars? So if you read an A-level physics book, it will say, if you find that, you will find life. Despite the fact that earlier I was explaining there is zero evidence that life can come from a chemical soup. And because what's missing from here is you need a creator. It's like saying, if I see iron ore in Australia, I'm going to see a motor car, because it just becomes a motor car. Well, it only becomes a motor car if you have a designer and a creator. And it's the same with these things. Those things produce nothing if there's no creator. And yet A-level physics books say that that will absolutely produce life, despite the fact that it is a fact of science that those things cannot produce life. So the most important ingredient to produce life is a creator. But that's left out. So if you study, this sometimes comes up in A-level physics, but more in a physics degree. If you do a physics degree, you have to learn the Drake equation, which looks complicated, but it's actually very simple. Because N is this number of habitable planets. And all those factors, F, 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 and F, it's like the number of galaxies, and the number of planets that are the right size, the number of planets that are habitable, then the number of galaxies. You multiply all these things out. If there are enough galaxies, if there are enough planets, the right size, the right distance from the sun, then you get the proportion of planets with life in the universe. But again, if you don't have a creator to put life on there, it doesn't matter how many factors you've got, doesn't matter how big the universe is. If you don't have a creator, you're not going to have life on a planet. But with this ridiculous assumption that life always comes from a chemical soup, this equation then is used to tell students there must be some other extraterrestrial life in the universe. I think when the Viking landers went to Mars in 1976, I think it was expensive, $5 billion to get that picture, but I think it was worth going to Mars once to explore God's creation. So I don't think that was a waste of money. It's good to explore God's creation. Was it worth going back to get a slightly bigger photograph? I think that was not a good use of money. Was it worth going back to get an even wider photograph to check the dust is still red and there's still no life there? And is it worth going back again and again and again to take more photographs of more rocks? It becomes a waste of money just to go back, to keep checking, is there any life in the red dust? It's a lot of dollars to keep checking the same conclusion. There are other places we could explore. ESA have also sent spacecraft to Mars. ESA sent the Mars Express in 2003, and if you are a taxpayer, if you were before 2003, you contributed to the cost of this spacecraft because it's paid for by all the taxpayers in Europe. Obviously, things will change if we leave Europe. That spacecraft, you can see on the top, there's another one popping at the top, and that one was Beagle. The United Kingdom built this one that piggybacked and was supposed to land on the surface of Mars. But for those of you who remember, it crashed into the surface of Mars and was obliterated. So it doesn't look like this. It looks more like this. It's in like 1,000 pieces. When I was working for the European Space Agency, my colleague who sat next to me was made the project manager for that Beagle. And I warned him, God will blow on that project, and that's what happened. And notice it was called Beagle, named after Darwin's ship. Because they were going to look for life, that's why God blew on it, and it cost £30 million, which was completely from UK taxpayers, and it crashed. So there's this fascination in searching for life on Mars, but there's been a probe to Titan and an incredible photograph of Titan's surface. That photograph cost $3 billion. That's an expensive photograph. Not the most beautiful photograph in the world, but it's very fascinating if you're an astronomer. And they went there because there's water, believed to be water, on Titan. And as you can imagine, they did not discover life there. Future missions, they want to go to Europa to get under the ice to see if there's any living creatures under the ice. And of course, there won't be any living creatures, but it will cost $10 billion to make that conclusion that there's no creatures under the ice. They want to spend $10 billion bringing dust back from the planet Mars. So they send a spacecraft and a lander there, and then a rocket will bring the dust back to Earth to check that it's still red and it's still dust and there's still no life in it. And that will be very expensive. And sending a man to Mars, which is a completely ridiculous thing, don't volunteer for that. And that will cost $100 billion and will be totally useless, apart from bringing some glory to the person who's mad enough to volunteer to do that. But then there's searching for extrasolar planets, because about 20 years ago, astronomers realized they could start to detect planets outside our own solar system. So those planets are called extrasolar planets, outside our solar system. And 20 years ago, they made a prediction. Astronomers predicted when they start discovering these planets, the prediction was they will show that the Earth is not special. And why would God bother creating planets outside the solar system? Surely that shows the Earth is not special. Actually, planets, billions of planets in the galaxy and the universe is exactly what you'd expect from a creator who loves variety, loves size. And what is interesting, after 20 years, astronomers are changing their tune, because they're now saying their original prediction was wrong. They're now finding the Earth is very, very special and totally unique. So they've actually changed their tune from 20 years ago. It's fun looking for extrasolar planets. It's very difficult because there can be a difference of 1 billion to 1 between the brightness of a star and the brightness of its planet. So it's very difficult to see the planet when it's next to something 1 billion times brighter. So it's a challenge, but fun to search for these planets. And they've now found thousands of planets. So just a quick bit of history. One of the first planets, in fact, the first one ever detected was 1995. It wasn't about 50 light years away. The first direct observation, because the previous one, it was just the star was wobbling. The first one they saw directly was actually 2004. The first time they could image something next to the star. Previously, it was just the star wobbling. So in 2004, it was very exciting. They actually saw a kind of planet next to a sun. So that was a big milestone in 2004. Another milestone was 2007, the first time they found a planet similar size to the Earth. So the Earth is 12,700 kilometers diameter. Planet Gliese was 20,000 kilometers diameter. But notice it had a 13-day year. You get very old on that planet. And it was only 10 million kilometers from the sun, so you fry in 1 second if you stood on that planet. So not very habitable at all. A significant milestone was in 2009. The Kepler telescope was launched, and it looks at many thousands of stars. It's detected thousands of planets, a few hundred are Earth-sized. About 10 are in a habitable zone, but not the right conditions at all for life. But that telescope was launched specifically to be looking for planets and life on planets. A major project in the future is called the ESA Darwin Project. Just look at the title of the project, Darwin Project. Space telescopes, an array to make the equivalent of a very large telescope, the idea to detect millions of planets, and named after Darwin because the main goal is to find extraterrestrial life, which it won't, because it doesn't exist. For many years, astronomers have been sitting up all night, listening to their radio telescope, waiting for a message from space. And after several decades, those who've been listening for 30 years haven't actually heard anything yet, but they still stay up. And some people actually run computer programs on their computers when they're just the spare time for running, and it's part of the SETI program, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, because when galaxies spin or do other things, it chucks radio waves at the Earth, and those radio waves are listened to in case one day they hear a very specific message. Because on the one hand, when a scientist sees amazing coding in the DNA, instead of making an obvious conclusion, there must be a creator, they just ignore that. But if there was a 10-second coded message from space, they would immediately believe that there's intelligent life in space. A bit of a contradiction there. But they haven't heard that 10-second clip yet. Astronomers also send messages into space. They have done for many years. In 1974, this message was sent with a radio telescope, just sending pulses into space, just to float through the universe. And it was sending out a message about numbers, atoms, molecules, human DNA, human being. And these messages are chucked into space by enthusiastic astronomers and other people who want to send messages into space. This is where it gets quite serious. I know this from first-hand experience working in the spacecraft industry. If a spacecraft is going to exit the solar system, like the Pioneer spacecraft, they knew after visiting Jupiter it would get chucked out of the solar system. The astronomers and scientists get very excited, and they say, we've got to put a message on this spacecraft, a bit like a message in a bottle. So we've got to have a message on the spacecraft because it's going to float through the universe, and in a million years it might get intercepted by some aliens, so we've got to have a message for them. This is how seriously they take it. So on the side of the spacecraft, this is what they drew. That is what was drawn on the side of the Pioneer spacecraft. I do apologize for the naked people. At first they had clothes, but then they said, but this might confuse the aliens. We have to take the clothes off. So they reluctantly took the clothes off, and it's a naked man, a naked woman. I don't know if you can spot the rest of the message. Because at the bottom, it's a schematic of the solar system, the sun on the left and the planets, and it's showing the spacecraft did a loop around Jupiter. So it's giving a bit of information. This ended up being a very controversial picture because when the rocket was on the launch pad, there was a complaint to ESA from the Feminist Society saying, hang on, the man is giving a greeting to the aliens. This gives the impression that men are more important than women. So you cannot do that. And NASA said, I'm sorry, but the spacecraft is on the launch pad. We cannot do anything now. So for the next million years, aliens think men are more important than women. Then later in 1977, the Voyager spacecraft was launched, also going to exit the solar system. So they went a step further. In this case, they created a phonograph system that would play a record phonograph. I assume there was a set of instructions how to do it. Gold-plated copper discs. So you see, these are the discs that were put on the Voyager spacecraft that are now on a spacecraft that has now exited the solar system and is floating through space. So there were greetings in 60 languages, 90 minutes of music, 115 analog pictures. If you interpret it, you can create pictures, sounds of surf, wind, thunder, birds. Just to show how important it is, a message from President Carter. By the way, the aliens would have no difficulty knowing The phonograph was important because it was wrapped in the American flag. So they knew this had to be important and opened. And that will last 100 million years, and there are people who feel a comfort from the fact that this phonograph will last 100 million years. It gives comfort to people that aliens now have 100 million years to intercept the spacecraft and play the phonograph. Some evolutionists have a real anxiety because they say, but hang on a minute, what happens if there is a message? Say tonight, an astronomer in the south of England, in Dorset somewhere, hears a message, and he's the only person in the world who's heard this message. What will happen? And some people are really worried, what would happen if some Russian astronomer picked up a message, immediately sent a message back saying, don't believe anything the Americans say, So it's a really worrying situation. And they even have held conferences on what happens if we detect a message. So the Secretary General of the United Nations, he goes around with a buzzer in his pocket. And if the buzzer goes, alien detection, he has to rush to New York to an emergency committee meeting at the headquarters, and a post-detection committee is held, including psychologists and scientists and other people. And a response is sent on behalf of humankind, not the Americans, not the Russians. Try and do it really quickly before any bad guys send a response. And if you read there's been a conference on this, if you look at the conference, the response must comply with equal opportunities. And if you look at the conference, it says, including a person's sexual orientation. So I don't know what the aliens will think of that. But there is a problem with communicating with aliens, because the closest planet is 4 light years away. Most planets are vastly further than 4 light years away. Imagine there was some life on a planet 100 light years away. That's really close. Well, it takes 100 years to get a question there, and it takes 100 years to get a reply. So you say to your great-grandchildren, if you ever met them, tell their great-grandchildren to watch out for a reply. And then the reply comes, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Can you say that again? So it's going to be difficult. So there are some of the reason for that first part was to show you that it's taken very seriously by secular science, and some people around the world put their hope and trust, an interest in life. It gives them a purpose in life, thinking that there's extraterrestrial life. But I want to show you why, from the Bible, it's really clear there is no extraterrestrial life in space. Searching for it wastes billions and billions of dollars that could be building schools and hospitals and doing all kinds of more useful things, and not distracting people. Ironically, the answer is in front of us in the Bible, and yet people are just stargazing, looking for answers in space, and there is no answers out there. So I'll just go through these things. This is really a quick summary. Genesis 1 describes the creation of the earth in the first 3 days of creation. The stars are then made in 1 day on day 4. That shows that the earth is really, really, really special, the center of God's purposes in the universe. Only 2 things are formed in creation. The earth is formed in 3 days. Man is formed from the ground. Eve was formed from the side of Adam. The stars were spoken into existence. The earth was formed because it's man's home. When an architect builds a house, it is formed very slowly, very carefully. It might take, half a year to carefully form a house. You build the garden in a day. It's the garden isn't that important. The house is important. And so with the universe, God formed the earth in 3 days. The rest of the universe was just spoken into existence. all well within one day. The purpose of the stars is for signs and seasons. And Genesis also says the stars are there to shine light on the earth. The stars have a purpose of serving the earth, spotlights for the earth. The stars are not there to hold extraterrestrial life. The stars were affected by the fall. We read that in the Psalms and in Hebrews. In Hebrews 1, verse 10, 11, the stars wax old as a garment. A similar verse in the Psalms. When Adam sinned, the stars were affected. We now see supernova stars exploding, dying because of Adam's sin. That shows that the earth is center of God's purposes, the fact that the whole universe is affected by what happens on the earth. Isaiah says that at the end of the world, when God's purposes are finished on the earth, the stars will be rolled up like a scroll. So that clearly shows that the earth is central to God's purposes. It would make no sense if there were 5,000 inhabited planets in the whole universe, if when God's purposes are finished on earth, everything else stops instantly. That only makes sense if life is dedicated to the earth. Isaiah makes it very clear when things finish on the earth, the whole universe finishes. Earth is central. The redemption of man. For God so loved the world, not for God so loved a world or a load of worlds. God loved the one and only world, the earth. Christ took on the form of a man. Christ did not take on the form of 5,000 different aliens, but just the form of a man. And Christ died once and for all. Jesus did not die 5,000 times for 5,000 planets and 5,000 different alien forms. Christ died once and for all. My book goes into more verses. These are the main things. My book gives more details for the theological reasons. As I say, I published my book in 2002. I was just slightly nervous publishing all this, but very soon after I wrote my book, other authors came out saying a very similar thing. A couple of years later, Gary Bates wrote a book with very similar conclusions, and then Danny Faulkner and other authors are very glad they came to the same conclusions. But this was in 2002 and one of the first books to make those conclusions. So what is the purpose of extrasolar planets? Well, God creates in abundance. You know, if you saw Blue Planet 2, and Genesis 1, God says, let the waters abound with an abundance of creatures. All through the Bible, God creates in abundance. David Attenborough said he was astonished by the abundance of creatures in the deep oceans. Well, he wouldn't have been astonished had he have read Genesis 1 or had he have known God's character. Everything that God creates, it is in abundance. It's no surprise he created an abundance of stars, an abundance of galaxies, an abundance of planets. And he knows that we enjoy exploring these things. It gives pleasure to man to stand still and consider the wondrous works of God. It gives pleasure to God to study his own creation. It shows the uniqueness of the solar system. Simon mentioned this verse earlier. God created the earth to be inhabited. It's a unique planet, and to show the wisdom of God. In my book, I explain quite a funny story how secular astronomers 100 years ago promised that they would count the number of galaxies in the universe. And they tried this project for decades. When they started to detect millions of galaxies, they said, don't worry, we've got a computer-controlled telescope, we'll count them with a computer. And after 40 or 50 years of swearing they would not give up on this project, After 50 or 60 years, they were totally humbled, and they said, despite promising, they had to declare a complete failure. They could not count the number of galaxies. It's just too many. And if you read Psalm 147, it says God counts. Not just counts the number of the stars, not just the galaxies, but the stars, but he knows them all by name. Astronomers have boring names for galaxies like 145C, but God has a beautiful name for every star in the universe, and that reminds us of his great power and great wisdom. So there's all kinds of purposes in the stars and the planets. Can man emigrate from Earth? I'll let you read this prediction by NASA, by their chief, Dan Goldin. NASA have these incredible ambitions that sometimes just don't have a bearing with reality. So in this quote, you can see NASA have an ambition of basically saving the human race. A lot of people see NASA as the savior of the world. They'll get humans to explore and get to other planets. But it's not possible to get to other planets. I'll show you an illustration of that in a minute. Space travel is really difficult, unhealthy. I wouldn't recommend it. Your organs expand from the first day. Your heart and other organs get bigger. It's not good for you. Your height starts increasing. Every bit of fluid has to be totally recycled on a spacecraft. I'll let you think about that. It's a really unhealthy thing, even if you survive the launch. And there are problems with space travel. Imagine you could travel at 1 million kilometers an hour. It's very fast, far faster than previous spacecraft. How long do you think it would take you to get to the nearest star and planet, which is Proxima Centauri, 4 light years away? That's just the closest. Most stars are much further than that. How long would it take if you were going 1 million kilometers an hour? How many days do you think it would take to get to the nearest star? How many days or how many years at 1 million kilometers an hour? The answer is it will take you 4,500 years if you traveled at 1 million kilometers an hour. It is not possible to get to another star. That chief of NASA saying that we will get humans to other planets, that is just not true. And I think he knows it, but he has to say that kind of thing to continue to get the support of the public and for the public to keep seeing NASA as their savior. Should man want to emigrate? Well, Psalm 115 says the heavens belong to God, the earth he has given to the children of men. If we have this insane desire to live on other planets, it's the opposite sin to the Tower of Babel. At the Tower of Babel, they didn't want to fill the earth. But having filled the earth, we shouldn't be wanting to fill space. It's a similar rebellion and sin to the Tower of Babel. Why is the universe so big? I think we even heard it in one of the clips earlier. The evolutionist atheist will often say, well, this vast universe, that just shows the Bible is wrong and the earth is not special. But my answer to them is, a vast universe is exactly what I would expect from the creator of the universe. It is exactly what I'd expect. Firstly, the earth is so special, it has many spotlights on it. An important home, like Buckingham Palace, has many spotlights, and the earth is a precious jewel with many spotlights shining on it. But the stars declare the glory of God, and you have to have a lot of stars to do justice to the glory of God. And the universe reveals God's attributes. The universe has to be vast to show us that God is vast. God wasn't going to create a diddy little universe. And as I said before, God creates in abundance. A vast universe is exactly what you'd expect from God. So the atheist is wrong saying the vast universe shows that the earth is not important. So, the secular worldview is the vast universe shows man is not important. A quotation from an Oxford professor claiming man is not unique. We're on an ordinary star in an ordinary galaxy, but that is not true. We are on a unique star in a unique and special galaxy. That is the truth. The secular worldview is that the purpose of life is to search for extraterrestrial life, and that man can somehow save himself, like I was talking about NASA. That, by the way, that quote on the bottom, that was the one I was referring to. Searching for extraterrestrial life is searching for the meaning of life. That was the subtitle of that book, Life on Other Worlds, published by Cambridge University Press. But the biblical worldview is the vast universe reveals God's glory. The purpose of life is to glorify God, not to search for extraterrestrial life. Man cannot save himself. A savior is needed. So we see this contrast. There is a judgment coming soon. That should be the focus of the world's attention. Not, is there extraterrestrial life, but is there a judgment coming? That should be the big question of the world today. And sadly, that is not what's at the forefront of people's mind. Having mentioned extraterrestrial life, Christmas is coming. And what is sad is people are saying, well, I wonder if aliens visited the Earth in the past. Well, we have had one extraterrestrial visit in the past. There has been one. And it's written in the Bible. And it was indicated by the Star of Bethlehem, which I believe was a supernatural star. So the earth was visited by a being from the heavens. But sadly, the world's not interested in that most incredible visit that we can read about in the Bible. Sadly, the world is distracted by looking for something that doesn't exist instead. The Star of Bethlehem shows the earth is special, that man is special, and of course the answers to life are clearly in the Bible. So we have this sad situation where it's a wonderful thing to be interested in questions of life. The answers are there in the Bible. God even sent a supernatural star to show the earth, but always, sadly, man is blind and is looking in the wrong place. And in modern times, the wrong place is looking into space, looking for this extraterrestrial life.